I'm a Fulbright specialist. I'm a professor of technology and law, specializing in intellectual property. I'm managing partner of a boutique law firm in San Francisco by the name of Lloyd & Mousilli. Before founding my own law firm, I was senior counsel at Apple. I was one of the original lawyers for the Apple Watch, and we were working on the technology ecosystem as well for the made for iOS system. So everything that's connected with a lightning cable, CarPlay, HomePlay, all of this ecosystem that works with Apple products. Before joining Apple, I was a lawyer for Dell, specializing in software and peripherals. Before that, I was an attorney for one of the biggest law firms in the world, DLA Piper. And I give you this background so you understand that I have a unique focus on technology and intellectual property issues. My educational background is in engineering. I'm a biomedical engineer. I have degrees in computer science and computer science engineering before doing my doctorate in law. This lecture is going to be focusing on some statistics to give you some backdrop on why Silicon Valley and why technology is such an important driver of the world's economy. And then we want to talk about the top legal issues for startups. So you recognize some of the potential pitfalls and problems that you can avoid when you're building your own company. So you'll see that we'll talk about a number of different issues and then focus on fundraising towards the end of this presentation. Why is technology such a big deal? You'll see that just this year, the US technology sector alone is worth more than $9.1 trillion. That's more than the entire European economy combined. Think about that for just 1 second. More than the entire European economy combined. And what's crazy is that this has happened within the last 3 years. I'm sorry, 13 years, I'm sorry. And that's a mistake on that 2017, it should be 2007. So within 13 years, the European economy had gone from being 4 times larger than the technology sector to now smaller than a single sector of the US economy. Another thing to put things in perspective, earlier this year, Apple became the first $2 trillion company. An absolutely amazing feat on its own, but what's even crazier is that it's managed to go from a $1 trillion company back in 2018 to double in size in terms of valuation internationally. These numbers are impossible to understand except in this perspective. And that's why we continue to see economies grow and technology sectors to continue to grow. People that had never even imagined owning a computer now own multiple. They'll own an iPad, they'll own a laptop, they might have a desktop at home, in addition to the smartphone device that's in their pocket that's more powerful than most computers had been even a few years ago. All of this has humble beginnings, right? You don't become a $2 trillion company, except that you'll see that they all started very humbly. And I love this TV show, HBO's Silicon Valley. It tells the story of 5 friends that come together to basically form a company and a startup. This might seem like a tremendous comedy, but it's actually based on facts and reality. This TV show has over 200 consultants that have verified the accuracy, not just from the legal standpoint, but from the technical standpoint. If you haven't seen this serial, I highly recommend that you watch it, as both it's instructive and humorous in a lot of ways. And we're going to talk about some of the issues, and I've developed an entire legal course for law students to learn the real stories and the real lessons from this TV show about starting a company. And like most people, they start their startup as a side hustle. This is an American idiom that talks about something that you're doing just on the side of your full-time job. All of these folks at one point ended up having an employment at a big company, at a technology firm, etc., and they had an idea that they wanted to nourish and to help grow. So one of the essential questions that you have to address early on is this side hustle, is this side project something that's going to get you into trouble down the line, right? And I'll take a show of hands. Do you guys think that working, for an employer, let's say that, you're working down the street here at D-Tech and you have an idea and an innovation. Exactly, right here, right here. Hello, thanks for joining us. So one of the things that you have to think about is the potential problems that you might have if you're doing something on this side. And absolutely want to encourage innovation. We want to encourage entrepreneurship, but you have to recognize that each situation can have its own problems. So if you're employed in a company that's in the energy field and you're working on a project that's also within oil and gas, this could be a problem, right? Most likely your employment contract will have stipulations about this. Obviously, if you're writing a song, it's completely unrelated. This is another form of intellectual property creation, right? But you have to think about your duties as an employee to your existing employer. You have to know what the laws are within the state and the country that you're working in, if they allow for you to have this kind of side hustle or side job or not. Because one of the main concerns is around inventorship agreements. So if you're working on something and then you're employed full-time and you have an invention that you're creating, more likely than not, the contract will dictate that your employer owns that invention. So that's why it's important to realize that this is a real consideration. No worries. So something else that you have to end up thinking about. Your startup is still just a project until you actually form a corporation around it, right? Until you set up a legal structure around it. And oftentimes you'll see people will run into trouble when they haven't formed a company and it's not clear around who owns what. And we'll talk about intellectual property in the next slide. So the first thing that we have to end up focusing on is the correct legal structure. You'll see that a lot of times people will go online and they'll try to use an online service to form a company, and that can oftentimes be dangerous because it's not the correct structure. It doesn't include the correct terms between you and your co-founders. So something that you have to think about is what type of company you're forming. A lot of times people end up assuming that, hey, what's the cheapest way that I can end up forming a company? Most of the time, it's a limited liability corporation. Do you have agreements between you and your co-founders? Those are things that will dictate what type of legal structure that you want. Now, most of the time, you'll end up seeing that if you're a startup and you're looking for venture capital funding, and we'll talk about venture capital later, but it's a specific type of funding and a specific type of investor that are looking at certain profiles for companies. Most of those become Delaware C corporations. And as you're probably aware, there's 50 states within the United States. So why is it that Delaware ends up getting picked? It's a small state on the eastern seaboard. It's a small state, and really amongst economies, California is a much larger economy. Texas is a much larger economy. New York, much more large and diverse economy. But what ends up happening, these investors have a certain way of functioning. Their lawyers are most familiar with Delaware law. They also have special courts in Delaware that only deal with company issues and company disputes. So you don't have a judge listening to a divorce case and then a will, an inheritance case, and then looking at a company issue. These judges only practice corporate law and look at corporate trial. When you're looking at which state to incorporate to, you have to think, if you're offering a service in a particular state, if you're offering insurance in the state of Texas, then you would have to end up incorporating and having some local presence in Texas. I'm providing a bit of this context so you understand what the rationale is where you end up forming. Because just not thinking through it and just automatically doing what your friend did is always a recipe for disaster, because your circumstances may be very different. Let's move on and we'll talk about IP ownership here. Yeah, the clicker is acting up a little bit. So one of the key elements and one of the things that makes startups in any company so valuable is their intellectual property. And normally, I wouldn't go into a definition of intellectual property, but I think it's important to just kind of review it for a second here and realize that your company name, when it's used and protected correctly, is a trademark. The logo that you end up using that identifies your goods and services is also a form of intellectual property. The domain name that you end up having is also a form of intellectual property. And then the inventions that you have, the software that you've written, all of these things are what make your company so valuable. And one of the key problems that a lot of founders end up having is if they don't have proper assignment, clear ownership, right? If you're working on a project with some friends and you're writing code, how do you determine who wrote what? Yes, there's code check-in and the ability to follow track changes and all, but ultimately the end product is composed of different pieces that everybody is contributing. And if you have a disagreement with a founder, what happens? Does everyone just take their marbles or their pieces of a game and go home? It doesn't work that way, right? A company cannot exist that way. And that's why making sure that everything that's created is owned by the company is an important first step. And you'll see that this is also why people need a clean break from their prior employers. You want to make sure that the company that you used to work for isn't going to have a claim to the stuff that you're developing and the work that you're doing. So that's why having clear IP and ownership is an important step early on. And you'll end up seeing there's all kinds of stories about that happen even with some of the biggest companies in the world. So there was a huge lawsuit between Uber and Google. Both of them are operating in the self-driving car space. Both of them want to create and develop autonomous vehicles. Now, it was a big problem when one of the companies that Google had acquired, called Waymo, one of their senior members and engineers left Google and was hired by Uber. This on its own is problematic because a lot of times when you're hiring from a competitor, you don't know what trade secrets, what unknown, undocumented information that they have. And there's also employment agreements that'll say, hey, you can go work for a competitor, you can't go work for a competitor. You have to wait 1 year, 2 years, some period of time. That's considered an anti-competition clause. But what's even more interesting about that particular case is that this engineer was documented to have downloaded massive amounts of code and software before leaving. You can read about that case. It's all very, very public. I won't get into those details, but I want to give you some context that these aren't just problems that small startups have, but even the biggest companies on earth will struggle with them. So this is why, again, you want to make sure that everybody, your founders, your employees, consultants, anyone who's writing code for your company, is also assigning all of that ownership to the company. Next slide, please. Maybe this will, exactly, there we go. Another consideration is related to just the concept of employment. There's different ways that people will be working for your company. They might be friends of yours that are just volunteering time. They might be folks that are actual employees with an employment contract, or they might be contractors, third parties that you've hired to end up providing services. Now, this is really important because each state and each country has their own set of employment laws. I'm not going to provide an opinion on Ukrainian employment law, and I won't get into the details of how California even differs from Texas in terms of employment law. There's a huge case going on right now in California related to Uber and its hiring of contractors, right? And how you treat a contractor can rise to the level of being an employee. And one of these, that's a lawsuit that's currently pending in California that ends up dictating how a company can treat these contractors. If you're controlling their time, if you're controlling the services that they're offering, their pay rates, etc., there's a lot of questions there. But what's important here to realize is that everyone that you're working with, you should have some sort of agreement in. If they're a third party, right, from some software company that's helping you write a piece of code for your product, you need to make sure that you are owning the code that they're developing and that it's clear what they're getting paid and that their deliverables are owned by the company, period. It's always fun when you're doing a technology presentation and the technology is the biggest issue. All right. Here's another common issue that a lot of startups and companies end up having, right? Specifically related to their contracts that they have. And those contracts come in all different shapes and sizes. And when I say that, people usually think of contracts as only a customer contract. But there's a lot more contracts that go into this. We talked about one type of contract when you were talking about the employees, right? That you want to make sure that you have a contract with your employees about ownership. The same thing with your service providers. But something else that happens is a lot of times if you're using and developing an app that's downloadable, those terms of use, those terms of service that most people don't read, that just click through, okay, 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 those are a contract. Those are a contract that you are entering into with your users. It might not be called a contract. Sometimes it's called a EULA, which stands for End User License Agreement. You're giving your users certain rights or a license to use your technology or your product. You're also dictating how you use their information. And information use is a privacy matter, and oftentimes is in a separate agreement called a privacy policy. And you'll see that, again, if you're developing apps that are on the Google Play Store or on the Apple App Store, you have to end up providing some privacy policy that'll talk about how you're using that information. Apple is very particular about what information that you're collecting from your users and making sure that you've disclosed that correctly. This is a huge issue right now with TikTok. So that TikTok is obviously a Chinese-owned company, ByteDance, and the amount of information that this app is collecting from every one of its users is absolutely incredible. There have been a lot of technical deep dives into the TikTok app that recognizes the amount of time that you're spending on a particular photo or a video, or which particular set of keywords you're searching for, right? Who you're connecting to, which videos you're sharing. Anyway, that gets into, this bigger question about privacy. So disclosing and being very clear and transparent with your users about which information you're collecting, from their geolocation, right, to their use, to the time that they're accessing your app. The fact that TikTok knows that you're at home, in bed, right, between midnight and 2 a.m. and what videos you might be watching at that point. That's all information and data that is dictated by your privacy policy. The other thing that you want to end up talking about, obviously, the contracts with your clients, right? If you're actually providing a service, you have a SaaS agreement or a software as a service agreement that they either click through or they end up agreeing to some way that's presented. So this is often something that's overlooked. The other thing that we want to focus on, and this is going to bring to the last part of our presentation today, we're going to be talking about fundraising. Everything ultimately comes down to your ability to pay and sustain your business. If you can't pay your employees, if you can't pay your contractors, you're not going to be a viable business. So the way that you end up raising money is going to be really, really critical to your success. And how you end up structuring the debt or the equity that you're giving out is a very important consideration. And that's why when you're looking at early stage fundraising, you'll typically see 3 different ways that people end up doing fundraising. And we'll talk about the benefits and the costs related to each of these. Convertible notes, right, are basically a promise, right, related to a certain amount of money that you're providing. Oftentimes, they'll have some interest rate that's tied to them. They'll be capped or uncapped related to the valuation of your company. You'll also end up looking at, a series seed round where you're presenting different types of stock or ownership of your company. And there's also different types of stock that you can offer. I don't want to get into the specifics because each one of these topics is book worthy on its own. They're complicated issues that you're going to end up learning and having to become very, very much an expert in very quickly when you're raising. Finally, I'll touch on this and we'll discuss it a little more, is this idea of a SAFE, right? A SAFE is a document that stands for Simple Agreement for Future Equity. This is a contract that was invented by Y Combinator, one of the most famous technology incubators based out of San Francisco. And the idea was that too often, investors and founders were spending way too long negotiating terms about, hey, what's the actual valuation of my company? How much equity percentage should I get for giving you any of this funds, etc. A SAFE is basically an agreement to put all of those considerations until later evaluation and analysis. That, hey, you only end up determining the amount of money that the investor is looking to invest, the valuation cap, right? What your company is basically valued at and what you can end up exceeding or not. And then finally, a discount rate that's being offered for early investors. And we're going to turn to the issue of fundraising here because this is one of the hottest topics. If you can just keep it in presentation mode. Understood. Perfect. So one of the things that you'll end up seeing, these are complicated issues, right, that have a lot of different details. You, as a founder, you're responsible for so much. Part of your responsibility as a CEO and a founder is to put together the right team. You have to hire smart people to do the things that they specialize in. And the same thing is true when you're working with your investors. Taking money from just anyone is usually a bad idea. There's a difference, and they'll talk about this smart money, right? Smart money is an investor who understands business, number one. You also want someone who understands your industry. So oftentimes we'll see that here in Ukraine in specific, a lot of the clients that I work with, they'll have an investor that'll come and say, okay, I'll give you $100,000. How much are you going to give me after 1 year? And this is incredible because the startup is not a bank that has a guaranteed interest rate or some other, investment vehicle that's going to guarantee you some return. It doesn't work that way. This is why it's called a venture, right? A venture, going to this route, it's an adventure, right? You're venturing out, you're going out to try something new, and inherently, it is risky. But with risk, there's reward. And that's what a smart investor recognizes, that, hey, you're working on something that's very new. You may fail, you may succeed, but ultimately having the right ingredients is going to ensure your success. And one of those essential ingredients is obviously funding. So one of the things that you want to think about too is if you're going into a particular industry, and let's use the oil and gas example, you want to make sure, and you're building a platform for, let's say, locating new sources of fuel, you want somebody who's a CEO or a vice president or someone who's working in this oil industry because they're going to understand your product, number one. Number two, they're going to be able to give you actual advice on how to better develop it. And three, they'll be able to make introductions potentially, right, to customers. And we'll talk about that. So it's important that if you have someone who is not sophisticated, right, that has this kind of gangster mentality, frankly, right, and how much are you going to give me after a year? And they're going to come knocking on your door, for this investment. They don't understand this principle. So it's important oftentimes to turn down money that's going to have more strings that are attached to it. Part of this is also making sure that you have the right counsel. Counsel is in all kinds of experiences. So counsel, typically people think of legal counsel, right? You want to make sure that you have the right lawyers that are on your team that understand and can help you through a lot of these questions. But you also want people that can counsel you on tax issues, for example. You also want, if you're doing something that has a lot of export and import, if you've got physical products, you want somebody who understands that as well. So having the right advisors or counsel is going to be critical to your success. We'll go on to the next slide. And this is one of Silicon Valley's, little secrets, right? Fundraising is hard. It's not just because you're in Ukraine or you're in Kyiv or some other country. Fundraising is fundamentally a difficult thing. And it's whether you're in a startup or you're raising money for a charity event. It's difficult to get people to part with their money. So one of the things that you have to be thinking about constantly is your network and expanding who your network is. It's important to understand that anyone that you're approaching understands your vision. And one of the things, because I work with investors and with venture capitalists as well, the thing that they tell you more often than not They're actually investing in people. If I trust you and I value you and I know that you're a hard worker, I don't care what you're doing. I know you're going to be successful. I know what it is that you're going to end up investing your time in to ensure the success of your business. So a lot of times you'll see serial entrepreneurs, right? Serial meaning in a series. They founded companies and they failed. Not a single one of these big technology companies that you see, from Steve Jobs to Bill Gates, every one of them founded multiple companies, right? And were involved in multiple ventures that ended up failing before they ultimately succeeded. So one of the things that you want to think about is not only someone who knows you, but understands your industry. This is where we were talking about smart money and dumb money. You don't want someone who doesn't understand your industry. They're going to be making all kinds of demands on you and your team that are going to be taking away from your energy. What's important too, and this is where the contracts always come out to play, that your agreements that you end up choosing, and we'll talk about which ones you can choose, lay out the terms for what information you have to provide them, how often you need to update them, etc. A lot of times, the best thing that you can be looking for is just a silent investor, someone who trusts you and gives you the money and isn't constantly bugging you for an update. But what's even better than a silent investor is a smart investor, someone who knows your industry and can make these introductions for you. Next slide, please. Before I get into these different stages, I want to just pause because I know we've covered a lot of material very quickly. Is there anything that you guys have a question about that you want to focus on, we can discuss before getting into the specifics of fundraising? And I don't know if there's anything online as well that's come in.
The question is more about fundraising in the USA and in Europe, different between the investors and the kind of thing.
Yeah.
Also, you can also saying that different considering, so there's a question and further I will do it.
Perfect. Yeah. It's federal law. Correct. There are protections at the state level for trade secrets and for trademarks. So even though you don't have a federal trademark registration, you can acquire local trademark rights within the geography that you're using it. And think of it like a bakery, right? And you come up with a bakery and you're wearing an Oxford t-shirt. Let's say we called it, the Oxford Bakery, right? You don't have a right to the term Oxford on its own, right? It's also a geographic name. But you, as an Oxford bakery, and you're producing baked goods in your neighborhood, you've become, known for that. So if another baker comes down the street and wants to open up another Oxford bakery, even though you don't have a state or a federal trademark registration, you can end up filing a suit against them to stop them from using the name that you've developed over the years that you've been operating. It's better, easier, faster, cheaper to do a registration. And this is one of the things that we teach all of our clients. As soon as you're doing your registration for your entity and you're setting up a new company and you have a unique name within this space, register a trademark, a federal trademark that's going to give you the rights. And I've had a completely other presentation just on trademark rights and the problems people have for not doing these registrations. So hopefully this addresses your question. Pleasure. Whenever we're talking about fundraising, the first thing that you need to be doing is what they call bootstrapping, right? Bootstrapping is the term where there were in the old times, you had boots and you had straps to them. The idea was that you can pick yourself up, right, by pulling up on your own boots. It's just an idiom or an expression to say that, hey, rely on yourself to help yourself. So when we talk about bootstrapping, if you're going to go approach anyone for money, the first thing that they want to see is that you've invested in yourself. If you haven't shown that you're going to invest your own money, your own savings into your project, there's no way someone's going to end up believing in you. Now, mind you, so many startup founders put everything that they have, right? It's a passion, right? You believe in what you're doing. And if you didn't believe in what you were doing, you wouldn't be spending the time and energy on it. Obviously, one of those big advantages is you don't have to go to people. Not everyone's born rich, right? So a lot of folks, you end up thinking about, Bill Gates came from a very wealthy family. His father, William Gates, was a very successful lawyer in the Washington area. And he had a lot of privileges that a lot of people don't. But you have plenty of folks who had privilege, right, but don't have that much money. So again, this is something that's really nice for some people. Obviously, it's impossible for the majority of people to just rely on bootstrapping. So one of the next areas that you have to look at is what they call your friends and family, right? You'll end up seeing that a lot of our startups, they have some uncle, right, or an aunt or some other relative that ends up providing them either a loan, right, or an investment early on to help them look at this. What's beautiful about this is that, again, the people that know you best believe in you the most. That's the way it works, right? And I don't want to talk about that beyond this, but you should not be shy to ask folks, right, to end up investing as part of this friends and family line. Something else that's often overlooked, there's a lot of small business grants that you can end up taking advantage of. And this is in every country, in every city, they're available, right? Governments recognize that entrepreneurs help the company, help the economy. It's an obvious incentive for them to have people start businesses and create businesses. Here in Ukraine, you have the Ukraine Startup Fund. It's relatively new, right? But it's encouraging folks to end up putting together a business idea and make that happen. And this is the same in the US with the Small Business Administration and a lot of other grants. But you have to research this and understand it. Talking to other founders is also helpful, but looking specifically at your industry is also a very good idea. Next slide, please. So one of the other things that you should look at, and I'm focused now on academics and universities commercializing their ideas. So I've joined the faculty at Kiev Polytechnic Institute to help them commercialize a lot of their research and technologies that they have there. And one of the best things that you can end up doing is reaching out to these professors and universities to understand what they've been developing. A lot of times, not only can you end up getting maybe a license to technology, right, to a patent or some other science that they've been developing, but there's a lot of grants that are tied to academic institutions too. And anytime you can be using something that's from an academic sphere to commercialize it, you're going to get a lot of support from the university, from the alumni and graduates of the university, and obviously from the people that are also interested in seeing that university succeed. The two other types of funding that we typically look at are angel investors. Angel investors are folks with a high net worth, right? And they don't have a problem writing checks. $25,000, $250,000. Obviously, it depends on the wealth of the individual, but there's angel investor networks that you can end up tapping into. And you can go online and have a number of these introductions. But most importantly, if you're working in a particular sphere, people will introduce you to folks. I've learned there's tremendous wealth, not just here, in Kyiv, but throughout Ukraine, folks that have, family businesses that they've developed and are willing to write checks for startups and other folks if they connect well with them. This is always one of your best options because the typical asks that they have aren't as strenuous as venture capital, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But what's really important is, again, finding folks, angels, that are within your industry. We keep on talking about oil and gas, but it's the same way across anything. If you're building a product and it's a SaaS platform for retailers, right? Reach out to folks that have retail shops, right? This is where you have to end up using your network, right? To get an introduction to someone who has, maybe 5 shops or something else. It doesn't need to be the Mango, or other kind of brand name franchises. But these are folks that, especially if they are in that same industry, they don't need to necessarily just write a check. But if they could allow you to test your platform at their stores, that's an amazing, amazing opportunity for you. It'll help you really test your product, get feedback, and potentially have an investor there. So angel investors are, one of the most critical ways that a lot of people end up growing, a lot of startups end up growing. Yeah.
So they're asking how much angel investment the founder can bring into the company. And basically, you're saying that from angel investor, you can look for up to 25 to 2,600 dollars. But how much equity is normal to give away for angel investors? Because for venture capital, there is some other different options available.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. And number one, the dollar amounts that you see up here, they're guidelines, right? They're generally what you end up seeing. Less than $25,000 in Western countries isn't a big investment, right? And it's something that, potentially, a family member can end up providing. With angel investors, the terms will differ. There isn't a standard formula for how much equity you get for the dollars that you end up providing. Because obviously, one of the biggest questions is what stage you're at in your development as well. And we can talk about that valuation at another session as well. But one of the things that we typically use with angel investors is this SAFE agreement, that standard agreement for future equity. That all it's doing is basically capturing the amount of the investment and the potential valuation cap that you're looking at for your company. And so it's basically deferring that entire calculation until you actually get a round that determines, your valuation and the amount that's due for the equity to play out. Venture capital is what you always see. This is the sexiest way, of raising money. You end up seeing these big names that'll come in and the big checks that come from it. But this is usually a complicated negotiation. A lot of times they're asking for board seats, right? They want to be able to control your board. They want to be able to have somebody who's an observer, right? Be able to see everything that's happening within the company. They'll ask for, a defined amount of equity, right, within certain spaces. What's typical is with 500 startups and Y Combinator and these like, they have a pretty standard exchange for $150,000 investment for 6 or 7% of your company. Those are fairly standard. They're not really competing on that dollar amount anymore. This is very labor intensive, right? It's going to take a lot of work and oftentimes months of negotiation before you can end up reaching an agreement with a lot of these venture capitalists. Something else that I didn't mention here, but you see a lot of times with these competitions. You have pitch competitions, etc. I'm personally not a big fan of pitch competitions for return on your value. Now, they're great at honing your pitch so you can say exactly what your product is, what your service is, so people can understand it very quickly. But in terms of the amount of time that you end up spending, oftentimes weeks preparing. I just came from the IT Arena conference in Lviv, and amazing teams, right? And many of our clients were within that top 10 ultimate. But looking at the actual dollar figures, the top is a $15,000 prize. That's a lot of money here. But if you spent that same time in front of anyone else in Western countries, it's not a lot of money, right? That same conference, that same competition and time that you've put in would easily end up netting much larger figures, frankly. Conferences are great for publicity. In the same way, whenever you think of, one of the most famous TV shows, Shark Tank, right? Shark Tank is amazing, but it's not amazing for the amount of money that you end up getting as an investor, right? And the kind of equity deals that you do. The real value in being on Shark Tank is the publicity, the exposure. Being able to say that I was on Shark Tank, knowing so many people might have seen you and later reach out to you. So that's a really important component to your own fundraising, is to raise your own profile. Let's move on to the last slide on funding sources. This slide I've titled Get Creative. And this is where you need to recognize, again, fundraising is hard. Everybody gets it, right? But there's a lot of creative ways that you can end up gaining value and building your startup. And one of these, I don't need to explain to Ukrainians, you guys know it probably better than anyone else, this concept of bartering, right? Offering something in exchange for something else, right? God knows how many folks, that you might know that are programmers or developers that can help you with a bit of code, or you need a machine learning component to your product, or some other friend of yours that can draw and create, your trademark or your marketing material for you. That's the way that it works. So typically something in exchange for something. And, you have some skill set that's available and worthwhile to someone else. So I'm not going to spend any more time talking about bartering. And that's something that a lot of times people overlook. Partnerships. And this is where recognizing that, hey, there's a particular company within your industry that could see a real benefit from your product, right? Don't think of them as a customer, right? And I think this is where having this mind shift from thinking of someone as someone that I can get money from to how can I learn from this person? And we go back to that retail example, right? If you're allowed into a retail store to test out, your retail intelligence platform, it's more important to learn about why your product isn't working well, or what improvements you can make to make it more worthwhile. And what's amazing is that a lot of times you can end up doing a licensing deal with them, right, just in exchange for developing a product for them. Oftentimes, this isn't, you know, as sexy as saying that, hey, we just signed a $25 million deal, you know, with this retailer, but it helps you gain the credibility and the learnings that you need to make a strategic product. The last kind of creative way is when you go and you realize that you have the perfect customer, right? And a lot of times these companies need development, but oftentimes don't have the internal resources for it. And this happens all the time in big industry. It's just a fact. These big companies like Shell, like Exxon, right, within the oil and gas space. And I apologize, but you know, I grew up in Texas, so everything is about oil and gas, and a lot of the companies that we represent are in oil and gas. And it's the perfect example, again, of companies that have been doing things for 100 years the same way. They didn't really care, right? Until the price of oil ends up dropping. And then every bit of efficiency is critical to you staying in business. If you can't cut your costs, you're going to go out of business. So when you approach a company that is a very traditional area, you might be able to get them to just cover your development costs because they have a pain, right? But they don't have the right team internally, right? Their IT team might only be good at keeping their computers connected to the network. Hopefully that's a good IT team for you. Most of the time, if you tell them to develop an app or to even write a little bit of code to optimize a particular process, it's completely outside of their scope. So when you approach these folks, right, and you approach a company seeking to commit to this major company, tell them, listen, we're going to build this product and it's specific to you, right? We're going to see what your particular pain points are and develop this. And that way, it's important to negotiate those terms, but they might want some kind of exclusivity on it. 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, something to give them an advantage and to allow them to commit to making that investment in you. And again, this is something that gets tricky, so you need to make sure that you're not giving ownership to the company just because they've funded you. And don't give up long time, right, for exclusivity. You know, it's just going to depend on the industry, obviously. But this is one of the best ways to find sources of funding because they're already making money, right? They have a real cost. They have a real problem that they're trying to address, and they can end up providing some resources to help you through that. That's, if we can go to that, to our last slide. That's the end of the presentation on these, you know, on startup legal. I wanted to give you guys the opportunity to ask me specific questions. If you've had a scenario where you've tried to go out and raise funds, or how you've approached a family member or an angel investor, because even role-playing these things with your friends and co-founders is going to make it a lot easier. You can reach out to me offline. The info email will go to our firm administrator, and you can just mention the fact that you're at Unit City, and we'll be able to route that. We produce a lot of material on our website to educate founders on entity choice issues and intellectual property issues, and you can find us on, you know, all of these major social media platforms. But I'll open it up to questions if we have any before we close.
Yeah, basically they're like asking if it's true that if you're looking to get the investment from venture capital, uh, you should first do any research that will of the different venture capital and to for particular fund then you can that have investment investment profiles companies like yours. And basically, you also, after that, you need to answer like questions if you can scale aggressively during the fundraising during the fundraising basically.
Yeah, absolutely. So, absolutely correct. In this economy, information is power. The more information that you have, the more knowledge that you have about your investor, the more likely you can use that information. A lot of venture capitalists are very narrow. They're only looking at B2B SaaS platforms in agriculture, period. Right? That's the only kind of investments that they're making. So if you're approaching a VC that's that narrow, you're wasting your time. If you have a personal connection to this VC, that venture capitalist may make other introductions for you. And this is something that people don't realize. It's the power of an introduction. So just the fact that I know someone who may know someone, having that introduction, when you have an email or a WhatsApp message that comes out and says, hey, I spoke with Feras and he suggested that I speak to you about this, it means a lot. Why? Because automatically your value, you're an unknown person, they don't know you from anyone else, you're associated with the person that made that introduction. If that person values Feras or whoever made that introduction, the least they'll do is respond to you, right? Knowing that that recommendation or that referral has some value. So don't underestimate reaching out to people within the industry and asking them, who do you suggest we work for? Who do you suggest that we reach out to? What's also beautiful, information, information, information. If you go to Crunchbase, there's a lot of very public information. If you see a startup in the US or in Europe that is in a similar space, you can go look up who their investors are. It's all public knowledge, right? You'll see their VCs or their angels, et cetera, who ended up contributing. A lot of it's in the press as well if you don't have a Crunchbase account. Reach out to those same people, right? If they've invested in one company within that industry, they're very likely to invest in another. Don't get into this mentality of zero sum, that, hey, they invested in my competitor, that means there's no way that they'll look at me. One of the things that's absolutely tremendous, and you'll see depending on the VC and the venture capital, players, some of them will invest in every single major competitor in the market. They're investing in Uber, right? And I'm blanking on the name of the competitor to Uber for a second here. But yeah, wow, okay. Somebody would be offended if I forgot, this name. But the idea is very simple. Lyft, yes, thank you. And I know lawyers at Lyft that are not going to be happy if they end up seeing this video, and I've completely forgotten their name as well. But the idea is that, again, that's public information, right? And if you can reach out to them, and when you tell them as a venture capitalist, if I receive an email and it says, hi, I'm so and so, I saw that you've invested in this company. We're very similar, but we're different for this reason. You're automatically stepping above most of the other emails that they're getting, right? So hopefully this addresses the question.
They also asked about the first part of our question about intellectual property. the question sounds like, what's the best time to register yourself? Because, for example, in USA, it took you a lot of time and also a big amount of money. So basically, you would like to first fundraise money for just to register your intellectual property. Then with those rights, you can go to the market and fundraise more money for products.
Yeah.
So what's the best time and how to do it?
So obviously I'm a lawyer, right? And, you know, I'll tell everyone, your most valuable assets are your intellectual property. One of the things people are like, we'll put it off, we'll put it off. And I'll give you a very real example. We represent a company, they make nutrition bars, and they were trying to launch a new brand of nutrition bars. And they were going back and forth on what name to use. In the meantime, they'd invested $500,000 in market research, in branding, colors, things like this, when they finally determined this is the name that they want to end up using. When they were ready to use it, we found that someone else had already applied for that name. And this, with registration of intellectual property, it's almost always first to file wins, period. So most of the time, it's go change your name, go find another name, right? And that's a huge blow to most companies, right? Especially you become emotionally attached to the name that you've created. It's a baby of yours, right? You've developed some press, some marketing, some search engine results that are tying it to. It's an expensive change. So for less than $2,000, right? And you can do it cheaper than that. We charge $1,500 for a trademark application and registration. The potential costs later are much greater. And when you realize that, this is where you realize, okay, at least with the name registration, that's one thing. Now with patents are much more expensive. But there's a cheaper way to start a patent. In the US, it's called a provisional patent, right? That'll cost you 1/3 of the price of a full non-provisional patent. So there's different strategies that you can use. But what's important is if you have an invention or you have a new way of doing something that is potentially patentable, you've raised your valuation immediately. You raise your ability to bring in funding. And there's statistical evidence on this that companies that have filed for patents, provisional or non-provisional, they have a much bigger valuation and an easier time raising funds. So it's an important component. Obviously, if you can't pay your software developer, right, and team, that's the first thing that you should do, right? But typically with developers, you can also pay in equity, right? And that's one of the beauties of giving out a portion of the pie. And I want to close with one last thing. As founders, don't be scared to give out parts of your company. You have to be generous. When you're thinking about your team, you need to incentivize them, especially if you're not paying them or you're not paying them market rates. Often founders are too greedy. They're like, no, I don't want to give anything away. I want to keep it all. But you have to remember that 100% of a small pie isn't as great as even 20% of a much larger pie. And that's the mentality that you have to think. If you don't have the right team in place, you can't grow your pie. So I'll close there, and thank you all for your time and your attention. Thank you.